one of the most effective ways of propagandizing people is the power of suggestion. For example, when you see in the headlines that we are experiencing the worst inflation in 40 years, that is propaganda. The CPI it is not the same CPI that we used in the 1980s. They are deliberately not using the same housing figures that we used in the 1980s. So when when you're seeing headlines that say that inflation is the worst in 40 years, what they are suggesting to you that you are, but they are causing people to draw their own conclusions, because that's what propaganda is all about, getting people to draw their own conclusions, and it's not their conclusion, it's planted in your friggin' head that this is the same as the 1980s, and that everything's going to return back to normal. Okay, if you were alive in the 1980s, then that's probably what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that it's just like the 1980s, 1982 or whatever, and inflation's going to go back down, and that this is temporary and we're not going in hyperinflation. So what's happening right now? First of all, Fed funds rate was 11.5% in the 1980s. There's no yield on bonds now. Real rates are negative. You get no yields from dollar denominated assets. Like, no, you don't. Okay. People are using their houses as savings accounts. When people look back 50 years from now, or less than 50 years from now, when they look back at the decline of the great American dollar empire, they're going to note in the history books that people were using their houses as savings account. Okay. When you see worst inflation in 40 years, we have the worst inflation on record in the United States. Okay. It's the worst inflation. M2 is out of control. We've got the worst inflation. There is no housing boom. Like, people are using their houses as friggin' savings accounts. They're getting their foot in the door, because the interest rate on a house, if you actually like adjust inflation, like, your real interest rate on a house is like friggin' -9%. The government's subsidizing you to buy a friggin' house. People are using houses as savings accounts. There's no yield in bond markets. It's all negative. Everything, it's all negative. Okay. CPI, worst inflation in 40 years is a propaganda headline designed to convince you that it's the 1980s and that inflation is going to go back down. Inflation's only just begun. Inflation's going to continue to get worse. So don't draw that ridiculous conclusion that it's the worst inflation in 40 years and this is normal. It's always going to